Judge E.D. Williams granted a temporary restraining order that limits the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department's ability to deploy riot control agents to disperse crowds assembled during unlawful gatherings. Now, many of the restrictions referenced in the order were currently prohibited under CMPD policy. The order does, however, prevent the department from deploying riot control agents in gatherings that involve protesters who are damaging the property of others. So we got the SBI's report back last week, and we, in fact, had a plan to discuss those findings from the review, in fact, early next week. However, the facts, or I should say the statements listed in the temporary restraining order compelled us to respond to the TRO. So I'll remind you that we do have an internal investigation still moving forward. So we are still reviewing the SBI document, but there are a few facts that we wanted to put out in response to the TRO. First, let me say unequivocally that there was no pre-planned operation by CMPD, Command, the Emergency Management Office, or anyone else to use officers to block protesters, box them in, or kettle, or anything else on the night of June the 2nd. That was never a plan. There were also dispersal orders given on the night of the 2nd at 5th and McDowell in response to officers being hit with objects in the head and in other places. And by the way, you'll find all these in the SBI's review that we'll release. And you can see they're supported by statements and also radio traffic and video. Lastly, and most importantly, as a show of the non-intent to box anyone in, you'll hear radio traffic when it's released, as well as evidence in the SBI review that there were 2 exits planned or asked for and given over the radio to make sure that the protesters, the rioters at the time, had a way to exit out of the area. Now, in plain talk, let me just, that sounds very technical and tactical, and let me just really explain what happened. On June 2nd, we had a peaceful protest, very large peaceful protest, and we had enjoyed nonviolence up to that point until about 9 o'clock at night. Around 8:30 to 9 o'clock, the crowd began to change slightly. Now, I've been in this job 28.5 years. I've been in crowd control my whole career. I know crowds. And I can say the crowds are made up of people. And one thing I want to state, make sure everybody understands, is that we know a crowd is made up of individuals. Crowds are very difficult to police, particularly when individuals in the crowd decide that they want to turn it from a lawful protest into an unlawful protest or violence. It is very difficult then to figure out once the violence happens, who's committing the violence, et cetera, and it becomes very dangerous for both the protesters, the nonviolent ones, as well as the officers who are there trying to police it. On the night of the 2nd, after the crowd began to turn, again, we enjoyed very peaceful protests from earlier in the day. When it began to turn, officers at 5th McDowell were hit with frozen water bottles and rocks and other objects. Dispersal orders were given. I think you'll find in the SBI review that those dispersal orders were given. Now, to those people who were there at the time that say they didn't hear them, they may be correct. It is very difficult with a large crowd. It's very confusing. You can be at one end of a crowd speaking to somebody or someone screaming in your ear and you don't hear it on the other side. We do our very best to make sure that we use acoustical devices to make sure that it can be heard, but nothing is ever foolproof. After those dispersal orders were given, we didn't have the wherewithal at the time to be able to physically disperse the crowds safely. So about 22 minutes later, after the crowd had left 5th and McDowell, they never dispersed. Dispersal in our minds being go away, they moved to another location. At that point, we moved to block their path from going up 4th Street. And we then deployed RCAs. Again, in our mind, from an unlawful assembly. We had already told them to disperse, and they haven't. We deployed RCAs to turn them back around 4th Street with the whole intent for them to disperse. Now, riot control chemical munitions were then thrown at the back end of 4th Street. There were no officers there to block any pathways, but again, those tactics were used, and the RCAs went back up 4th Street into the crowd. Now, we're not perfect. We're made up of human beings as well, and we review our tactics every day. And of course, we're reviewing the tactics we used then. The tactics that we used the night of the 2nd up on 4th Street, where the folks were doused with chemical munitions from the back end, won't be repeated again. We look to get better. Our idea is that we want to make sure people are dispersed safely, with a minimal amount of munitions as possible. We certainly want to prevent physical force. So we're reviewing what took place. We don't take pride in operational or tactical decisions that or operations that don't get carried out the way we would like. Of course, we all here would like to have a different outcome than happened on the 2nd. But for a shifting of winds that put the crowd into the air of the munitions, we may not be talking today about this. We use munitions as a last resort to prevent physical violence. We take no pleasure in people being irritated by the munitions. And lastly, let me say this. Not only am I a career CMPD officer, I'm also a father and a citizen. I have kids the same age as the protesters. I have upheld an oath to make sure that people could exercise their constitutional right to protest. It would not be in my nature to purposefully, harmfully use riot control agents against people who had no avenue of escape. That was never the intent. We'll get better. We're trying to get better. We wish that the events on the night of the 2nd went differently. We absolutely uphold the public's right to be able to protest. I think you've seen in large measure since then, our efforts have been aided by the people who are protesting, doing so lawfully. So in closing, we're a learning agency. We're getting better. We'll learn from this. We adjust our tactics. In fact, most of the things that were listed in the TRO were things that we already do. Any gaps we saw in our policies that we could close in response to the night of the 2nd, we've done so, and we'll continue to do so. So with that, we'll entertain any questions that you have.
There doesn't appear to be any questions at all, Chief. No questions. There's no questions.
Deputy Chief, can you hear me?
I got you.
Yeah, this is Ruben from Spectrum News. So appreciate the recap of reaction from the restraining order. So just to be clear here, what, if anything, does this change for your policy going forward?
So it temporarily prevents us from being able to deploy riot control agents in gatherings that involve protesters who are damaging the property of others. It limits us just to physical violence. So if someone is damaging property or is in an act of damaging property, we have to use physical force first before we can use riot control agents.
Derek Dillinger.
As far as what you guys are dealing with specifically, I mean, how with those protests when they turn violent. Now, granted, this has not happened over the last several days, even though there have been some. They've been largely peaceful, even though there have been some moments. How much do you feel this is going to limit what you guys can do in terms of what you have to do to respond to these incidents? Is this going to be severely limiting your ability to police those incidents, or is this going to be something where you guys are going to have to find different ways to respond to them? And just go a little bit more as to how you're going to be having to adjust to this TRO.
Yeah, I understand. So it'll slow us down, but we have to find ways to make sure that it doesn't slow us down in ways that compromise officer safety. What it really does, though, is forces us to have to physically intervene if there's some property damage going on. And there are times when it's impossible nearly to physically intervene without unnecessarily risking the safety of the officers out there when property damage is going on. So minus physical violence, property damage, we are prohibited from using riot control agents to stop the damage of property. That's basically what it does. You know, we have no control over the TRO, but of course, you know, we'll abide by it.
Mike Stolt.
Mike?
Hi. This is Mike from Channel 9. I just want to be clear. So this investigation with the SBI is wrapped up. Is there any action at all being taken against any officers related to this incident?
Not from the SBI review. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, we have an ongoing internal investigation, as is commonplace. It's cultural here in the agency. Whenever we have an allegation of wrongdoing, we investigate it fully. What I said in the beginning was, and I meant it, when we have a way that we can improve tactically and that we can make sure that we you know, don't repeat any errors of tactics, then we do so. And that's currently what we're doing. We've already tightened up policies that we saw needed tightening up. And we're doing an internal investigation on the actions of all of our employees.
Andrew, fully involved.
Andrew?
Hey, Chief. Quick question. They're saying not to use the riot tactics with tear gas. Do you guys think that using physical violence or physical restraint on these protesters would be more physically harming to the protesters? And then second part of that question, wouldn't that put CMPD in hot water? Let's say a protester comes back and says, hey, CMPD injured me during this, instead of using the chemical agents. Wouldn't that put you guys in more hot water using physical force?
Well, I think you got a loaded question there. Just to say, even outside of a riot situation, anytime that we have to resort to using physical force to subdue someone, the risk of injury to both the officer and the person being arrested goes up. It goes up exponentially when you're talking about a riotous crowd, because it is by nature violent. It is very confusing. You don't know who is a protester who's not down for violence, and you don't know who is. And so when we aren't able to create distance and space by irritating the physical senses of the person, and we have to intervene, then yes, we have to physically intervene. So anytime we have to physically intervene, the chances of injury goes up exponentially. Again, this is why I'm highlighting that if there's property damage ongoing, we won't be able to prevent property damage from ongoing use by RCAs.
Amanda Forster.
Amanda?
Hi there. You say physically intervening. I'm wondering if you can clarify a little bit more specifically what you mean by that moving forward. And also, it seems that officers had been kind of back a couple blocks in recent evenings with protests in Uptown after hours. Will this change how close officers are going to be to the actual protest in the next couple of nights?
No, and so I'll take the first, let me do the first question. So what you mean by physically intervening, that means stopping whoever is trying to damage the property. That and again, what we're trying to say is if that occurs outside a line where we can't physically safely go, it may prevent us from being able to create the space outside the lines to be able to go and intervene. I mean, that's the bottom line. And physically intervene means go and put our hands on people. As far as the second goes, you know, I want everyone to remember we have had many protests, very large in numbers, where it's gone off without a hitch. And so our response is always in relation to what the crowd does. So if a crowd is out there at midnight and they're marching and chanting and not violating any crime, there won't be anything from us other than support. You'll find we'll block streets. Of course, we marched with protesters. So the reason why we're far away is because we have protesters who are obeying the law. As soon as they start to become violent or damage someone else's property, in other words, break the law, then we intervene.
Derek Dillinger.
Derek. Derek, you there?
Mike Stoll.
All right, Mike. Mike.
They still have their hands up. I think that cleared them, Chief. I think
Okay.
you're clear. I want to thank everybody.
Appreciate everybody joining us today. I hope that cleared up what the TRO will do to the officers out trying to protect the citizens of Charlotte. And I hope that you'll read through the SBI's review and compare that with what the quote-unquote facts were in the TRO. Thank you for listening.